At dawn, Frost held the pines silent as a county worker noticed disturbed leaves beside a drainage culvert off Old Mill Road, where winter runoff exposed fabric that should not exist, drawing deputies into a cordoned square of earth, breath clouding, notebooks opening, dread settling without a single word spoken. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The investigation that followed would stretch across decades, through filing cabinets that smelled of paper and dust, across holidays marked by empty chairs, and through a North Carolina community that learned to live with an unanswered absence. The victim was identified as Hannah Marie Whitaker, 22 years old, a recent community college graduate working seasonal retail shifts while saving for nursing school. She had grown up nearby, knew the back roads, and had driven them countless times without incident. Her disappearance arrived during the last week of November 1996, when Thanksgiving leftovers still filled refrigerators and the first Christmas lights were being tested along Main Street. She was last seen leaving a late shift at a discount store near the county line, planning to stop briefly at her apartment before meeting friends for coffee. When she failed to arrive, calls went unanswered. By the next morning, concern hardened into fear, and a missing person report was filed at the sheriff's office, typed on a standard form that would soon become worn from handling. Early canvassing focused on the familiar triangle of home, work, and routine errands. Deputies logged odometer readings, photographed parking lots, and collected time cards. Weather records noted an unseasonably cold snap, clear skies, and overnight lows that could preserve trace evidence longer than usual. Flyers appeared on corkboards, gas station windows, and church vestibules. Hannah's photograph printed in black and white, her eyes steady, expression neutral. Local newspapers ran short items beside holiday ads, careful not to speculate. Within 48 hours, the drainage culvert off Old Mill Road was sealed, surveyed, and processed under portable lights. The area sat between farmland and a thinning stand of pines, a place drivers passed without noticing. Evidence technicians worked methodically, bagging clothing, photographing tire impressions, and marking the slope where runoff had shifted soil. An autopsy conducted at the regional medical examiner's office avoided conjecture, documenting time since death within a cautious range consistent with the missing timeline, noting exposure to cold, and preserving fibers and trace materials for later comparison. There was no rush to judgment, only a recognition that patience would be required. Hannah's car was located 2 days later in a commuter lot near the highway, unlocked, keys missing, windshield filmed with frost. The interior showed nothing out of place, no obvious signs of struggle, a detail that complicated assumptions. Detectives documented the vehicle's position, canvassed nearby businesses, and requested traffic camera reviews where available, though coverage was sparse in 1996. Tips arrived steadily, many well-meaning, some contradictory, all logged. Friends and coworkers were interviewed in quiet rooms. Their recollections placed Hannah within ordinary routines, no known conflicts, no plans to leave town. Bank records showed no unusual activity. Phone logs ended abruptly the night she vanished. As December advanced, the town shifted into seasonal rhythms. Wreaths hung on courthouse doors and the investigation moved indoors, boxes stacked, evidence labeled, hypotheses tested and discarded. Detectives compared fiber samples against known sources, checked repair shops for unfamiliar tire patterns, and revisited the culvert after heavy rains. Nothing conclusive surfaced. Media attention remained measured, respectful, avoiding lurid language. The case was transferred to a cold file as Christmas approached, not abandoned, simply paused by necessity. Hannah's family marked the holidays quietly, attending services, accepting casseroles, answering the same questions. Investigators kept notes, circled dates, and promised periodic review. In January 1997, A renewed push examined transient labor crews working nearby projects. Employment rosters were subpoenaed, addresses checked, and alibis verified. One name appeared briefly, then faded for lack of corroboration. Another line followed a prior offender who had moved through the area, only to be eliminated by documented incarceration. The method was exhaustive, the pace slow. Years passed. Records migrated from paper to microfilm, then to early digital indexes. Each Thanksgiving, the sheriff's office received calls asking if there had been progress. The answer remained cautious. In 2005, a routine audit flagged preserved evidence suitable for newer DNA testing. Swabs and fibers were retrieved, their chain of custody intact, documentation complete. Results returned partial, insufficient alone, but enough to justify retention. Detectives updated timelines, mapped cell tower coverage retrospectively, and noted gaps. In 2014, a tip from a retired mechanic referenced a truck scene near Old Mill Road that winter, remembered because of a repair request made days later. The memory was imprecise but logged. Investigators cross-referenced vehicle registrations, ownership changes, and employment records, building a quiet matrix of possibilities. By the 20th anniversary, the case was formally reopened. Cold case detectives brought fresh eyes, re-interviewed witnesses, and walked the culvert again, measuring distances with modern tools. Seasonal context mattered: the shorter days, the traffic patterns, the holiday schedules. A re-examination of the car revealed overlooked particulate consistent with the culvert soil, a link previously inconclusive. Analysts compared profiles against expanding databases. Progress remained incremental but real. As December returned, wreaths again hung on doors and the file grew heavier, more precise. The community noticed unmarked cars, quiet visits, renewed subpoenas. There was still no public announcement, only careful work moving forward. Hannah Whitaker's name remained on a list reviewed each quarter, a reminder that time had passed but obligations had not. Evidence waited, preserved through winters and summers, until the right comparison would finally connect. That moment had not yet arrived in this chapter, but the foundation was set, quietly, lawfully, and without spectacle. As another Christmas approached and investigators prepared to test one more assumption against the record, knowing the truth would require endurance rather than noise. The first phase closed with files aligned, evidence secured, and a community holding its breath, unaware that a lawful resolution was slowly taking shape beyond the holiday lights and early darkness. This account pauses here at the edge of renewed scrutiny, before the decisive links emerged, when procedure would finally meet opportunity and the record would speak plainly, as it always intended, once the season turned. The next steps remained bounded by law, careful testing, and the patience learned by those who had waded through many winters, trusting that method would prevail over haste. With calendars marked and evidence queued, the investigation moved forward again, steady, unspectacular, and resolute, carrying Hannah's name into another December, where answers waited in sequence, not yet spoken. The work continued unseen until a convergence of records, science, and memory would alter the course of a case once thought settled into silence. That convergence lay ahead, anchored in patient review and the resolve to finish what began beside a culvert on a cold morning, when notes opened and dread settled without a single word. Time would test that resolve, but it held, reinforced by process and record, as the case moved toward its eventual accounting, still unseen here but inevitable under scrutiny. Winter passed, files thickened, and the groundwork was complete, awaiting the precise moment when evidence would align decisively. That moment would come later, beyond this opening account, after more testing, more interviews, and the careful sifting of holiday memories against verified fact. For now, the record remains open, methodical, and restrained, faithful to procedure, carrying forward into the next phase without flourish. The promise of resolution rested in custody logs and lab queues, where science waited its turn. It was not a matter of belief, but of time. And so the investigation advanced inch by inch, through winters counted by calendars and lights, until the quiet certainty of method would prevail. The story continues beyond this point, where diligence prepared the way for accountability, grounded in proof and the law waiting just out of sight. In this place, during this season, nothing moved quickly, but nothing was forgotten. The file remained active, its margins annotated, its contents intact, until the sequence of facts would finally close the circle begun in Frost. That closing lay ahead, earned through restraint and review, not spectacle. For now, the opening stands, complete in its foundation, awaiting the evidence that would speak next. This account will proceed accordingly, step by step, as the case moves forward from 1996 toward resolution, anchored in the cold months that first held the truth. The groundwork is laid, the tone set, and the record prepared to receive what comes next, without haste, without excess. It remains to continue, as all thorough investigations do, until completion. With that, the first segment concludes, measured, factual, and unresolved, as intended, setting the path ahead. The narrative pauses, not ending but preparing for the next movement in a long inquiry, shaped by winter and patience, waiting for evidence to align. The account will resume, carrying forward with care and precision. The reopened inquiry gathered momentum during the winter of 2016, when the sheriff authorized a full cold case review and reassigned 2 senior investigators whose careers had begun around the time Hannah Whitaker vanished. Their approach was conservative, grounded in record integrity and verification rather than theory. They started by inventorying every item held in evidence, confirming seals, dates, and custodians, and reconciling discrepancies between handwritten logs and later digital entries. Nothing was missing, a fact that mattered. They rebuilt the timeline from scratch, beginning with Hannah's last confirmed work shift, noting clock-out time, weather conditions, and traffic patterns typical for the week after Thanksgiving. Store surveillance, grainy by modern standards, was re-examined frame by frame. Analysts noted a shadow crossing the lot at a consistent angle, a truck passing twice within minutes, details once dismissed as ambient movement. Investigators requested enhancement using current software, not to invent clarity but to stabilize images and extract measurable data. The result was limited but useful, providing an estimated vehicle height and wheelbase range. Concurrently, the team revisited the commuter lot where Hannah's car was found. They traced maintenance records, lighting changes, and resurfacing work that had altered the scene over 2 decades. Old photographs showed a temporary holiday charity drop box near the entrance that year, drawing brief stops by drivers. Witness interviews were reopened, conducted patiently, acknowledging memory decay. Some recollections sharpened with context, others faded. A former coworker recalled a routine she had forgotten, Hannah often leaving a note on her windshield to remind herself to buy milk after work, a habit corroborated by a receipt found later in her apartment. That receipt dated the night of her disappearance, unused. Attention returned to Old Mill Road. Hydrology maps showed runoff patterns that winter, explaining how evidence surfaced when it did. Soil analysis confirmed the Culvert area could receive debris from a narrow corridor along the road shoulder, suggesting a brief stop rather than prolonged activity. Tire impression comparisons narrowed the field further, excluding several popular models. The mechanic's tip from 2014 resurfaced. Records identified a dark pickup serviced for undercarriage damage days after Thanksgiving 1996. Ownership traced to a man named Thomas Ray Caldwell, then 32, employed with a regional contractor that had crews rotating through nearby counties. Caldwell had no prior violent convictions, but had been cited for driving offenses. His employment records placed him in the area during the relevant window. Investigators verified addresses, interviewed former supervisors, and confirmed he had access to a company fuel card that showed purchases along Hannah's route. None of this was proof, but it justified further inquiry. DNA technology had advanced since the earlier partial results. The lab was asked to attempt a new extraction from preserved fibers recovered from Hannah's clothing. This time, a clearer profile emerged, suitable for comparison. Analysts ran it through national databases, receiving a familial match to a distant relative of Caldwell. The probability did not identify him outright, but it narrowed focus lawfully. Detectives sought additional corroboration before approaching him. They reviewed Caldwell's history after 1996, noting a move out of state, a marriage, then a divorce, steady employment, no arrests. Property records showed he had sold the pickup in 1998. The buyer was located and interviewed. He remembered repairing a dented rocker panel and replacing tires soon after purchase. Photographs from the time matched the enhanced surveillance estimates. Investigators returned to Caldwell's former residences, seeking consent to collect discarded DNA. Legal counsel ensured compliance at every step. A discarded coffee cup obtained during a voluntary meeting provided a reference sample. The comparison was definitive. The profile matched the evidence from Hannah's clothing within accepted scientific thresholds. With probable cause established, detectives compiled a warrant affidavit detailing the timeline, vehicle analysis, DNA linkage, and corroborating records. A judge reviewed and approved the warrant in December, a timing not lost on the team. Caldwell was arrested without incident at his home, the news breaking quietly, reported with restraint by local outlets that remembered Hannah's name. Interrogation followed protocol. Caldwell denied involvement initially, offering alibis that could not be fully substantiated after so many years. Investigators presented evidence incrementally, allowing him to respond. He requested counsel. The case moved to prosecutors who evaluated charge options, mindful of evidentiary standards. The medical examiner reviewed findings again, aligning cause and manner with the evidence, careful to avoid overstatement. In January, a grand jury returned an indictment. The community reacted with a subdued mix of relief and sorrow. The Whitaker family received notification in person, then chose privacy. Pretrial proceedings unfolded methodically. Defense motions challenged chain of custody and the timing of DNA testing. Hearings addressed each claim with records supporting admissibility. Experts testified about the limits and strengths of the evidence, emphasizing procedure. The trial began the following fall. Jurors listened to a narrative built on records, science, and careful inference. Seasonal context returned as exhibits showed holiday schedules and weather logs, grounding the timeline in reality. There were no dramatic revelations, only accumulation. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the principal charge. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, acknowledging the years past without diminishing accountability. Caldwell received a lengthy prison term. The judge spoke briefly about the weight of time and the endurance of evidence. In the aftermath, Old Mill Road remained unchanged, the culvert repaired, the shoulder graded. The sheriff's office archived the case with final annotations, noting resolution. Hannah Whitaker's name was removed from the active list, not forgotten but placed in the record as answered. The holidays that year carried a different tone. There were no celebrations at the courthouse, only the quiet closing of a file and the recognition that patience and procedure had prevailed. The community adjusted, absorbing the outcome without spectacle. For investigators, the work concluded with paperwork and reflection. For the family, closure arrived in measured steps. The case stood as an example of how method, restraint, and time could converge, even across decades, to deliver a lawful end. The trial record continued to expand as prosecutors prepared the evidentiary spine that would carry the case to conclusion, and every step reflected a discipline shaped by years of waiting. They organized exhibits chronologically, aligning weather logs, payroll sheets, fuel card statements, and maintenance invoices to show presence without inference. Maps were introduced to explain distances measured in minutes, not miles, and to situate Old Mill Road between ordinary destinations Hannah Whitaker traveled routinely. The strategy avoided narrative flourish, relying instead on the quiet force of documentation. Expert witnesses were selected for clarity rather than personality, their resumes vetted, their testimony rehearsed to ensure precision. Defense counsel pressed on gaps created by time, arguing memory erosion and lost context, and the court addressed each point with rulings anchored in precedent. Jurors were instructed carefully on how to weigh scientific evidence, particularly the DNA comparison that linked Thomas Ray Caldwell to fibers recovered from Hannah's clothing. The lab analyst explained probability in plain terms, emphasizing exclusionary power and the safeguards used to prevent contamination. Cross-examination explored alternate explanations, but records showed preservation protocols intact from 1996 onward. The vehicle analysis followed, presenting enhancement methods that stabilized images without inventing detail, accompanied by limitations acknowledged openly. Tire size ranges, wheelbase estimates, and undercarriage damage reports were laid side by side with repair invoices from December 1996. None of it stood alone. Together, it formed a lattice of corroboration. Witnesses from Hannah's workplace testified to schedules and routines, confirming the ordinary nature of her final evening. Their statements were restrained, focused on times and observations rather than emotion. A former property manager described the commuter lot as it existed then, including the temporary holiday charity drop box that attracted brief stops by passing drivers. Traffic engineers explained seasonal flow changes during the Thanksgiving weekend, grounding movement patterns in data. The medical examiner summarized findings again, careful to avoid speculation, noting consistency with environmental exposure and timing. The defense offered character witnesses for Caldwell and challenged the significance of circumstantial links, but the court reminded jurors of the standard: proof beyond a reasonable doubt derived from the whole of the evidence. Closing arguments returned to method, not motive, urging attention to records that did not forget. Deliberations lasted 2 days. Jurors requested read backs of expert testimony and asked to review chain of custody logs. When the verdict was announced, it arrived without theatrics. The guilty finding reflected acceptance of cumulative proof. Sentencing occurred weeks later. The court imposed a term consistent with statutory ranges, acknowledging the gravity of the offense and the passage of time. Victim impact statements were brief and composed, emphasizing memory and loss without anger. The judge noted the role of persistence and the integrity of preserved evidence, and cautioned against reading lessons beyond the case itself. The appellate window opened and closed without reversal. Motions were denied in written orders that cited record and rule. In the months that followed, the sheriff's office conducted an internal review, documenting practices that proved decisive. Evidence retention policies were updated, cold case audits scheduled, and training materials revised to emphasize seasonal context and environmental factors. The culvert off Old Mill Road was photographed one last time for the file, then released from special designation. Local press published a final account that balanced conclusion with restraint, avoiding speculation and respecting privacy. The Whitaker family marked the next holidays quietly, choosing remembrance over public statement. A scholarship was established in Hannah's name at the community college she had attended, funded without fanfare. For investigators nearing retirement, the case offered a measured sense of completion. Files were boxed and labeled with final dispositions, digital copies archived with redundant backups. The lead detective wrote a brief memo reflecting on patience and process, noting that time complicates but does not defeat careful work. Younger officers studied the case as an example of continuity across generations of policing. The courthouse returned to routine calendars, the trial replaced by new dockets, the verdict absorbed into public record. Old Mill Road remained a pass-through, unremarkable, its history held only in files. Years later, when questions surfaced during community meetings about unresolved cases, Hannah Whitaker's name was cited as evidence that resolution is possible without spectacle. The answer emphasized diligence, lawful methods, and respect for evidence. There were no claims of heroism, only acknowledgement of teamwork and record-keeping. The quiet aftermath persisted, shaped by acceptance rather than celebration. Closure did not erase loss, but it restored order to the record. As seasons continued to turn, the narrative settled into its final form, a sequence of verifiable steps leading to accountability. The case closed not with a revelation but with alignment, documents matching science, memory supported by data, and law applied without haste. In December, wreaths again appeared on courthouse doors, indistinguishable from years past. Inside, a file sat complete, its margins annotated, its questions answered. The community moved forward, carrying the knowledge that patience had meaning, and that winter, once again, had yielded the truth to those willing to wait. The correctional phase proceeded with the same restraint that had characterized the investigation. Intake records documented Caldwell's transfer and classification, noting age, health, and security level. Appeals counsel filed routine notices, and appellate briefs focused narrowly on evidentiary rulings already addressed at trial. Opinions issued months later affirmed the lower court, citing established standards for scientific testimony and chain of custody. With appellate review exhausted, the sentence became final. The parole board calendar placed eligibility years into the future, subject to statutory criteria and behavior, a distant consideration recorded without commentary. Public records requests declined as interest waned. The sheriff's office responded to the last inquiries with copies of final orders and a statement confirming closure. Training seminars referenced the case to underscore the value of preserving context, such as seasonal traffic and weather, which had framed the timeline accurately. Archivists ensured that digital scans matched originals, performing checksum verification to prevent degradation. Evidence was cataloged for long-term storage, with destruction schedules set only where law permitted and consultation completed with the district attorney. For the Whitaker family, practical matters followed emotional ones. Personal effects held in evidence were returned with inventories. The family requested that certain items be retained for educational use, a decision documented and approved. Counseling resources were offered and accepted privately. On anniversaries, notes were exchanged with investigators who had worked the case, brief messages acknowledging shared effort. There were no press conferences, only acknowledgments filed in letters. The town's memory adjusted slowly. A mural proposal was declined in favor of a bench placed near the community college library, its plaque minimal, stating a name and dates. Students passed without stopping, and that was acceptable. The scholarship recipients wrote thank you notes kept in a small folder by the family. Each winter, the culvert flooded and receded, unchanged by its history. Within the department, policy revisions took hold. Cold case units received dedicated funding for evidence testing at set intervals. Partnerships with regional labs were formalized to prevent backlog. Supervisors emphasized documentation standards that would withstand decades. The lesson was procedural, not emotional. Retirements followed, promotions occurred, and institutional memory was refreshed through manuals rather than anecdotes. The legal record closed with a final notation entered by the clerk, the case number marked resolved. Researchers reviewing historical patterns later cited the matter as an example of delayed accountability achieved through cumulative proof. They noted the absence of confessions and the reliance on corroboration, a model consistent with best practice. The narrative remained grounded in what could be shown. As time placed distance between event and resolution, the community's attention returned to ordinary concerns. New cases arrived, each demanding care. The winter lights came and went. The bench by the library weathered. In files and databases, the name Hannah Marie Whitaker remained, attached to a complete arc from disappearance to judgment. The story did not end with triumph, but with order restored to the record. In closing, the case stands as a reminder that truth can be patient, that evidence kept with integrity retains its voice, and that seasons, however many they pass, do not erase the obligations of the law. The quiet aftermath endures, measured and sufficient, allowing those affected to live forward without forgetting. The finality rests not in celebration, but in the certainty that the work was finished properly, and that the cold months which first concealed the facts ultimately preserved them until they could be understood. Records remain accessible, footnoted and indexed, ready for review by anyone seeking to understand how careful process resolves uncertainty. There is no epilogue beyond this accounting, only the steady assurance that diligence matters. In North Carolina, during winters marked by holidays and quiet roads, a community learned that patience can yield justice without noise, and that memory, supported by evidence, can endure. That understanding remains, passed along through files and training rooms, sustaining confidence in method long after attention fades and seasons turn onward. With the verdict entered and the sentence imposed, attention shifted to the long administrative phase that follows major prosecutions, a period rarely noticed by the public but essential to the integrity of the outcome. Court clerks finalized transcripts, ensuring that every motion, ruling, and exhibit reference was accurately indexed. Certified copies were distributed to appellate counsel, the district attorney's archive, and the sheriff's records unit. Each document carried dates that spanned more than 20 years, a visible reminder of how long the case had traveled before reaching resolution. The evidence room inventory was reconciled one final time, cross-checked against courtroom exhibits to confirm that nothing had been misplaced during trial. Items not required for future proceedings were resecured for long-term storage under conditions specified by statute. The process was meticulous, reflecting an understanding that even after conviction, the record must remain unimpeachable. In parallel, internal debriefings were conducted within the investigative team. These were not celebratory meetings, but structured reviews intended to extract lessons. Detectives discussed early assumptions from 1996 that had narrowed focus prematurely, noting how limited technology and seasonal pressures had influenced decision-making. They examined which pieces of information had remained dormant for years, such as the mechanic's recollection and the fuel card records, and why those threads had not been pursued earlier. The goal was not to assign blame but to improve future responses. Training officers translated these observations into updated protocols, emphasizing the importance of preserving peripheral records that may not seem significant at the time. Winter conditions, holiday staffing changes, and temporary community features like seasonal charity installations were added as checklist considerations for missing person cases. The Whitaker investigation became part of a formal curriculum for new detectives, presented without names during initial sessions to focus on process rather than outcome. Later modules revealed the full case, illustrating how patience and documentation could compensate for the absence of eyewitnesses or confessions. The DNA component was highlighted carefully, framed not as a miracle solution, but as one element that required corroboration. Analysts stressed that science had spoken clearly only because evidence had been preserved properly decades earlier. The lesson was continuity, the idea that each generation of officers holds the case in trust for the next. Outside law enforcement, the judicial system absorbed the case into its archives. Legal journals summarized the appellate decisions, noting the court's reaffirmation of standards governing delayed forensic testing. Scholars pointed to the rulings as guidance for future cold case litigation, particularly in balancing defendants' rights against the probative value of preserved evidence. None of these discussions referenced emotion. They focused on rule, precedent, and method. The case's endurance through review reinforced confidence in lawful process. Community response evolved gradually. Initial reactions after the arrest had been restrained, shaped by years of uncertainty. After sentencing, interest declined further, replaced by a quiet acceptance. Local newspapers ran a final follow-up piece near Christmas, framed as a reflection rather than a headline. It noted the scholarship fund, the bench by the college library, and the sheriff's policy updates. Letters to the editor were brief, expressing relief without triumph. For many residents, especially older men who had followed the case since the 90s, the resolution carried a sober weight. It confirmed that some questions do eventually receive answers, though often long after the moment when those answers could have changed the course of a life. The Whitaker family navigated their own administrative path. Victim compensation paperwork was completed, counseling services documented, and estate matters revisited with finality. They chose not to participate in public advocacy, preferring privacy. Family correspondence with investigators tapered off into holiday cards, exchanged annually for a time, then less frequently as years passed. The relationship settled into memory rather than necessity. Within the correctional system, Thomas Ray Caldwell's case proceeded like any other. Classification reviews considered age and conduct, assigning him to a facility appropriate for long-term incarceration. Program eligibility was assessed according to policy, not publicity. His name appeared on rosters and schedules, indistinct from others. Periodic reviews noted compliance and adjustment. There were no special provisions, no exceptional treatment. The law had taken custody, and the matter moved forward routinely. As the years after conviction accumulated, the case's presence in daily conversation faded. What remained was institutional memory. Annual audits of cold case files referenced the Whitaker matter as a benchmark, reminding supervisors that dormant files deserve periodic review. Grants were secured to support evidence testing on a schedule, preventing reliance on chance or individual initiative. Interagency agreements were strengthened to share resources across county lines, addressing the mobility of suspects that had complicated the early investigation. Seasonal awareness became a recurring theme in training. Instructors emphasized how holidays alter routines, staffing, and travel patterns, creating both obstacles and opportunities for investigation. Thanksgiving travel had influenced traffic on Hannah's route. Christmas schedules had delayed some early follow-ups. These details, once seen as incidental, were reframed as integral to understanding timelines. The case thus reshaped how investigators approached winter disappearances across the region. From a broader perspective, the resolution contributed to public trust in gradual, methodical justice. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden revelation. Instead, the outcome demonstrated that cumulative evidence, handled carefully, can withstand time. For an older audience accustomed to slower rhythms and long arcs, this aspect resonated. The story aligned with lived experience, where answers are earned through persistence rather than spectacle. Each December, the sheriff's office now conducts a quiet review of unresolved cases, an internal practice inspired in part by the Whitaker investigation. Names are read, dates noted, evidence assessed. Some files advance, others remain unchanged. The ritual is procedural, not ceremonial, reinforcing responsibility without sentimentality. It reflects an understanding that winter, with its reduced daylight and altered routines, remains a critical context for both crime and investigation. The physical landscape bears little trace of the events of 1996. Old Mill Road has been resurfaced, drainage improved, signage updated. Drivers pass without awareness. The commuter lot has new lighting, security cameras, and painted lines. These changes are logged in municipal records, part of ordinary progress. Only the files preserve the earlier configuration, frozen in photographs and diagrams. For those who worked the case from beginning to end, retirement eventually arrived. Exit interviews captured their reflections, many referencing the Whitaker file as an example of unfinished business completed late. They spoke of discipline learned, of restraint valued. These accounts were summarized, anonymized, and stored with training materials, ensuring that individual memory translated into institutional knowledge. The legal closure also allowed space for reflection on the limitations of the system. Officials acknowledged that justice delayed carries costs, particularly for families. While the outcome affirmed the process, it did not erase the years without answers. This acknowledgement informed victim services policy, expanding long-term support options rather than assuming closure occurs at sentencing. The Whitaker case thus influenced practice beyond its immediate resolution. As the narrative matured into history, it settled into a stable form. Researchers, journalists, and students who reviewed the case encountered a consistent record, free of contradiction. They saw how each step built upon the last, how errors were corrected, and how patience prevailed. The absence of sensational language in official summaries became a feature rather than a flaw, reinforcing credibility. The holidays continued to mark time. Each Thanksgiving and Christmas passed without public ceremony related to the case, which itself was a sign of completion. The community no longer waited for news. Instead, it carried the quiet assurance that the question had been answered as fully as possible. That assurance did not demand attention, it simply existed. In the end, the fourth movement of the case was defined by consolidation. Records were finalized, lessons codified, and attention redirected. The investigation's energy diffused into policy, training, and routine, its extraordinary aspects absorbed into ordinary practice. This was not an ending in the narrative sense, but a settling, a return to equilibrium after disruption. The work had been finished properly. That fact, more than any single detail, defined the legacy of the North Carolina 1996 cold case. It demonstrated that method survives time, that evidence retains meaning, and that even in seasons defined by repetition and tradition, progress can occur quietly. The case no longer demanded vigilance. It offered instruction. And with that, the account moved toward its final phase, where aftermath gives way to enduring record, and winter becomes simply winter again. The final phase of the record unfolded without announcement, marked not by events but by the steady confirmation that nothing more remained to be done. Clerks closed calendars, archivists sealed boxes, and the electronic docket reflected a status that would not change again. The North Carolina 1996 case settled into permanence, its movement complete, its questions answered within the limits of proof. What endured afterward was not drama, but documentation, a sequence of verified actions preserved so that the conclusion would stand as long as the record itself. In the years following the conviction, periodic reviews affirmed that the evidentiary chain remained intact. Auditors checked seals and storage conditions, confirming compliance with retention statutes. Digital backups were tested, hashes verified, and access logs reviewed. These tasks were routine, yet they mattered. They ensured that if the case were ever revisited for study or challenge, the materials would speak clearly and consistently. No anomalies surfaced. The file rested. Public memory continued to thin. The arrest and trial, once the subject of quiet conversation, became a reference point rather than a topic. Older residents recalled where they had been when Hannah Whitaker disappeared, and later when the arrest came decades on. For them, the resolution fit the pace of life they understood, where time stretches, patience accumulates, and certainty arrives late, if at all. The absence of spectacle felt appropriate. It matched the town's temperament and the manner in which the truth had been found. The Whitaker family maintained privacy. They attended services, marked anniversaries, and declined interviews. The scholarship quietly supported students who shared Hannah's interests, a practical gesture aligned with her plans for nursing. Recipients learned the name, read a short biography, and moved on with their studies. The bench by the library weathered seasons without ceremony. This understated remembrance mirrored the case itself, resolved without flourish. Within the justice system, the case informed policy beyond county lines. Regional conferences referenced it when discussing delayed prosecutions and forensic preservation. Speakers emphasized that no single technique resolved the matter, that success lay in accumulation and corroboration. They cautioned against reliance on confession and underscored the value of environmental context, such as weather and seasonal travel, in reconstructing timelines. These lessons entered manuals and slide decks, then became part of standard training, indistinguishable from other best practices. The correctional record proceeded predictably. Annual reviews documented conduct and participation, noting nothing exceptional. Parole eligibility dates appeared on schedules far into the future, subject to statutory criteria. Decisions would be made by boards guided by rule, not by the notoriety of the case. The system absorbed the sentence as it does all sentences, converting judgment into routine administration. As decades turned, the landscape continued to change. Old Mill Road carried more traffic. The culvert improved to handle heavier runoff. The commuter lot gained cameras and brighter lighting. These upgrades were recorded in municipal minutes, unrelated to the case but informed by the same impulse to prevent harm through design. The physical traces of 1996 faded entirely, preserved only in photographs and diagrams. The sheriff's office maintained its annual winter review of unresolved cases, a practice now institutionalized. The ritual remained quiet, procedural, and brief. Names were read, evidence assessed, and action items noted. Some cases advanced, others did not. The Whitaker file served as a reminder that progress can come after long dormancy, but it did not create unrealistic expectations. Investigators understood that each case carries its own constraints. For the prosecutors who handled the matter, the outcome reinforced a preference for restraint. Their office updated guidelines on communicating with families in long-running cases, emphasizing candor about uncertainty and the importance of preserving hope without promising resolution. These guidelines reflected experience rather than ideology, shaped by years of measured contact with the Whitakers. Academic treatments of the case appeared occasionally, focused on evidentiary law. Articles cited the appellate opinions for their clear articulation of standards governing delayed forensic testing. The tone remained technical. The human story stayed in the background, present but not exploited. This balance contributed to the case's credibility as a reference point. The final legal milestone occurred quietly when statutory timeframes elapsed without further filings. The clerk entered a closing notation, and the docket ceased activity. From that moment, the case existed only as record and memory. There were no pending motions, no scheduled hearings. The law had completed its work. In reflecting on the total arc, officials noted the absence of shortcuts. The investigation did not benefit from chance confession or sudden discovery. It advanced through methodical review, improved science, and lawful collection. Each step was documented, each inference supported. This approach took time, but it ensured durability. The verdict rested on a foundation that did not depend on a single witness or moment. For those who followed the case across years, particularly older men accustomed to long cycles of work and family, the resolution affirmed a familiar truth. Some answers arrive only after persistence, and some wrongs are corrected late. The system, imperfect and slow, can still function when evidence is respected and patience maintained. This understanding did not erase grief, but it provided a measure of order. Seasonal markers continued to frame memory. Thanksgiving passed with its rituals of gathering and reflection. Christmas brought lights and quiet roads. New Year arrived with calendars turning. These cycles had surrounded the disappearance and later the arrest, bookending the case in ordinary time. Their repetition underscored how life moves forward even as records remain fixed. In the end, the North Carolina 1996 cold case resolved not into legend but into documentation. The victim's name, Hannah Marie Whitaker, remained attached to a complete narrative, from disappearance to judgment. The suspect, Thomas Ray Caldwell, became an entry in correctional rosters, his identity defined by lawful outcome rather than rumor. The community returned to its routines, carrying a quiet certainty that the question had been answered as fully as the evidence allowed. There were no final speeches, no commemorations. The closure was administrative and sufficient. It allowed institutions to proceed and families to live forward. It demonstrated that diligence, applied steadily, can overcome the erosion of time. The record stands ready for review, its integrity preserved, its conclusions verifiable. As winters continue to pass, the case remains resolved. It no longer demands attention, only respect for the process that brought it to rest. The truth did not arrive quickly, but it arrived cleanly, supported by law and proof. That is the final accounting, and it endures, quiet and complete.